The list was composed of the individuals sitting at the end of the table. I hope that you would at least know which firearms are on that list or what firearms are not on the list. Is the Benelli R1 semi-auto hunting rifle prohibited? The Auto Ordnance M1 carbine, the Remington Model 742 Woodmaster hunting rifle.
Answer your question.
And
if
I
you have that information.
appreciate your thoughts on how I should ask my questions.
Again, I think it would be helpful to point out which paragraph on the list it is at.
With respect,
400.
the question is to
Thank you.
Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly. You were here last, and you frankly weren't able to answer most of my questions.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
That's why they're here.
Canada is a signatory to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes that everyone has the right to own property and provides that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her property. Bill C-21 is a piece of legislation that breaks this social contract. Beyond the obvious point of liberty, it also infringes on both the right to possess guns themselves and a right to personal health and freedom. Now you tell me, and to the Canadians who are watching, you tell me which is likely to have a larger impact on public safety. Being able to scan virtually every vehicle and every container that comes into our country, or taking property away that's sitting there idly in the lockers and vaults of everyday Canadians. What are you going to do when Weatherby loads their 460 Weatherby to produce 9,999 joules?
We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms. The committee is resuming clause-by-clause consideration, and we will resume shortly with Mr. Zimmer having the floor. But before we resume debate, I will now welcome the officials who are with us today. We have, once again, Paula Clarke, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. Phaedra Glushek, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Rachel Mainville-Dale, Acting Director General, Firearms Policy. And joining us freshly today, we have from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Mr. Director Daly, Rob Daly, Director Strategic Policy, Canadian's Firearm Program, and Murray Smith, Technical Specialist, Canadian Firearms Program. So thank you all for joining us today. Your assistance is most appreciated. Your answers to our numerous technical questions will help us fulfill our duties in the lawmaking process. So, Madame Michaud and then Mr. Calkins.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll allow you to continue, I believe, because I did have questions. Well, my understanding is not complete. You're saying that we could have extra meetings next week and to have the minister come in for supplementary estimates instead of doing this during regular committee hours. Is this what I understood?
That is the suggestion I'm making. We have a work plan. We're trying to follow it. The work plan is that we would bring ministers in on estimates after C-21 and preferably before the break. So this is a suggestion that the clerk and I look for another meeting slot next week, and if so, to invite the minister or one or both of the ministers to attend in that slot. And I'm looking for unanimous consent for that. But before I do that, I know that Mr. Calkins has a wish to speak, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I would just appreciate being put on the speaker's list, not for this particular issue that you're talking about right now, but after Mr. Whatever is on the speaking list dealing with the
we'll put you there. And Mr. Motz, I believe, wants on the speaking list, or you want on this?
On this matter, Chair,
okay.
if I may. Thank you very much. Obviously, we don't agree to unanimous consent on any additional meetings. you know, we're fine to pause the review of C-21 if the ministers need to attend, and that we return to C-21 after those appearances are done. If you know, any extra meetings that you do have has the impact of other resources and other committees elsewhere, and that's always a concern that we have. We have a regular, I don't think any extra meetings are required at all, to be honest with you, and if we become, it's necessary, we can pass the ministers, the estimates for the ministers on division, because we're going to have the main estimates come in the after the new year anyway. So I don't see any need to have any extra meetings, and we certainly don't support it.
Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want a little bit of clarity. First of all, I'd like to confirm that it is both the ministers that would be attending. Second of all, I'd like to confirm that it is December 10th that is the deadline for the ministers to come for the supplementary estimates, because if that is the case, then it does need to be this is quite urgent. If not, if Mr. Motz is correct, then it's not urgent, but if it is December 10th with the deadline, I would suggest that ideally it could happen during committee time, but ministers, of course, don't always have control over their own schedules. So we would have to be flexible and be, I think, willing to try to find a compromise of where the ministers are available. From my perspective, from the NDP perspective, it would be very important to have the ministers testify before this committee.
So the deadline for returning our report is the 10th, I believe. However, we have had in the past, and we can do so in going forward, we can have ministers afterwards. But I believe it's a moot point at this point, because we're not going to get unanimous consent to do this. I would suggest to the committee that we talk about this amongst ourselves over the coming few days and see what we can work out to find a time for the ministers to come. Okay?
Sir.
Madame Michaud.
Donc, pour clarifier,
So to clarify, we don't have unanimous consent to have extra meetings, am I understanding? Well, I don't give my consent. I think that if we are going to receive the minister for the supplementary estimates before December the 10th, it should be during the regular committee hours, and we could pause C-21, but I don't agree to add extra hours, extra committee hours next week.
And that actually conforms with what Mr. Motz has said. So there is no unanimous consent. We do have a work plan that we all agreed to, that it was passed by the committee, and it was that estimates would happen after C-21. I understand things have changed a little bit, but let us get amongst ourselves and see if we can work something out. Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask for a vote on this so that we can at least be done with it, so we don't waste any more of everybody's time.
We can't actually vote on this. We can't move a motion because we have a motion on the floor. That's why I was looking for unanimous consent. So let's try to find a way forward on this behind the scenes, so that we can. It would be good to have the ministers here to talk to them on the various issues, but let's see what we can work out offline. Okay. That being the case, let us resume our deliberations on G4, and Mr. Zimmer, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming, and it's nice to see addition of some experts on the file. Last committee meeting, I was here and asked many questions and didn't get answers, and that's fair. You don't. Again, I said that you don't know what you don't know, but so let's get on with it. I think the question of the day in Canada is, especially in our firearms community, is are there hunting rifles on the new prohibited list? So I have composed a list, and I'm going to ask you, it's not a comprehensive list, but it's several firearms. It gives Canadians a good idea of what's on the list. So is the Benelli R1 semi-auto hunting rifle prohibited?
Thank you for the photo. Whereabouts is that listed on the schedule, if you can refer to the schedule? And we cannot comment whether or not a gun is listed as a hunting or rifle or not. What we can say is that whether it meets the criteria or not, and if it meets the criteria, it is on the list.
Maybe these questions would be better asked of Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly.
Yes, go ahead, but I would remind Mr. Zimmer that we can't use props.
Yeah, and all it is I know, you know, just for quick reference, I know these the experts at the end of the table might see the image and be able to get a quicker answer based on the image, and that's why I have them. So is the Benelli R1 semi-auto hunting rifle prohibited?
Can you point out where it is on the list that you're referring to? We see the picture, but...
Sorry, I'm asking Mr. Smith and Mr.
Sure, and that
Daly.
might help my colleague where it is on the schedule. Could you point that out for us?
Well, let me just say this. The list was composed of the individuals sitting at the end of the table that are the experts that have actually been participating in building this legislation. I hope that you would at least know which firearms are on that list or what firearms are not on the list. And the question is to Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly.
I would remind everyone that the list that is in G4 that we've made public, of course, has not yet been moved, and it may change at some point. But given that it's at least 480 pages, we might give the witnesses some time to.
I know as a person that got the list just recently, I wasn't involved in the compiling of that list. I've been through it several times in the last 7 days. So I would just suggest that this should be a fairly straightforward answer.
The Benelli R1 rifle is not listed in either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Okay, I can't hear. I don't know if there's any sound.
Do I need to repeat, sir?
Okay, that's fine.
Sir, if you could repeat your answer.
Yeah.
The member couldn't hear you.
Okay. The Benelli R1 rifle is not listed in either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Okay, let's go to the next example. The Remington Model 742 Woodmaster hunting rifle. Is this on the list to be prohibited?
Mr. Zimmer?
No point of order, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was going to say props.
I'm just trying to help our witnesses more quickly recall which firearms are on the list.
The minister can...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. A prop is a prop, Mr. Chair. And I believe props are not permitted.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Yeah, so the standing orders against use of props pertains in the committee room, so I really would ask you to...
It's an image of one of the firearms listed on the prohibited on the amendment, so my hope is that it would help and aid our witnesses, but I'll go on. I'll just read off the actual model. The Remington Model 742 Woodmaster hunting rifle, is that prohibited on the list?
Again, I think it would be helpful to point out which paragraph on the list it is at and whether it's on the 1 to 96, which already prohibits or which just codifies previously prohibited firearms,
or
if
question
it's on
isn't,
the
with
new
respect,
400.
the question is to
you.
Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly. And if I would ask that they answer these questions. You were here last meeting, and you frankly weren't able to answer most of my questions.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
That's why they're here. So that's why I'm
Van
directing
Bynen
my
on point of order.
questions to the witnesses that can answer my questions.
Mr. Van Bynen on point of order.
It wasn't my point of order, but I'll turn it over to Talib. I think it was his point of order.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Sarai on his point. On somebody's point of order. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it would behoove us all if we could perhaps not harass the witnesses that are trying to be helpful, and I think this is the tone. If we just make a comment on the tone in respect of the witnesses who are here giving us their time.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. Mr. Zimmer, go ahead. You may ask specifically of the witnesses whom you want to ask the questions of. Ultimately, it's the chair's prerogative to recognize speaking or not. But I understand that
my hope, Mr. Chair, and I respect you for that.
Please don't interrupt me, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
I would certainly understand that you would like the Canadian Firearm Program to answer these particular questions. So
thank you.
Go ahead. Did you need to re-ask
I can ask it again, Mr. Smith. Is the Remington Model 742 Woodmaster hunting rifle prohibited and on this list?
That particular rifle does not appear on either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Okay. Next one.
Actually, Mr. Zimmer, I wonder when you say this list whether you might specify, because there is the existing schedules out there, and then there is the proposed list of that may or may not be introduced later with G46.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'm referring to is the legislation C21 that's before us today and the amendments that are also before us. So that's where my questions are coming from, and that's where they're sourced from as well. So I'll continue on. Is the auto ordinance M1 carbine hunting rifle, will it be prohibited as according to this amendment?
I believe that is on the list, but I would have to check to be entirely sure. It should be
check.
in the M1 carbine section.
I can assure you they're on the list. I'm just asking you to confirm it.
Yeah, so
It would be helpful if a member of the committee could provide and pinpoint the location of the specific make and model that he is asking about. That would better facilitate our ability to answer your question
And
if you have that
I
information.
appreciate
with-
your thoughts on how I should ask my questions. But I am asking my questions the way I have, I guess, organized them. And I'm asking them of our firearms experts, as again, I'm looking for answers as opposed to not knowing the answer. So that's why I'm asking Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly my questions.
I think it's a fair point that if you know where it is in the list, you could help them to.
It's a fair point, but it is in the amendment and it is in the legislation. So, you know, if I can, I know I've researched this document extensively in the last week. And again, my assumption would have been that the experts, and I assume that they have, would know what firearms are on the list or aren't on the list.
I'd just like to add to my colleague's point that there are numerous firearms on the list. There are about 400 pages, from what I understand.
Mr.
So
Smith?
absolutely would be very helpful for us to point out. So we can facilitate the answers today for you.
Sorry, my questions to Mr. Smith and Mr. Daly.
the firearm you mentioned, I believe, is the auto ordnance M1 carbine, and that appears on the list of Schedule 2 at paragraph 81, subparagraph F.
Good. Yes, I knew that as well. So next question, is the Browning Rifle Bar Mark III hunting rifle, is it on the list to be prohibited?
It's that particular rifle is not on either list, Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Not right now, but will it be?
As a part of the amendment, maybe I should ask it more clearly. As Amendment G46 lays out, will it be on that prohibited list if G46 were to pass? On the prohibited list.
What is or is not on the list is a matter of policy, and I'm not in a position to address.
You're not in a position to address
on
what's on the list of G46, the amendment that was put before us?
So I would remind Mr. Zimmer that that motion is not moved yet. The list is provided
it's
for public
public
information, for
Yeah.
discussion, but it's not, we don't know if it's going to pass or how it might change. So you just bear that in mind.
Yeah. I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. I just know that for you're appearing today to answer questions based on C21 and possible proposed amendments to C21. That's how I'm basing my questions, and that's why you're here today to answer those questions. And it seems pretty clear to have a knowledge of what's on that amendment would have been it's a public document, it's out there, that you would have a good knowledge of that document. And I would say I will let you know that the Browning Rifle Bar Mark III hunting rifle is on the list. So I'll ask you this question. Will the Browning Rifle Bar Mark III safari hunting rifle, will it be prohibited if this amendment passes?
I don't recall seeing the bar on the list. Perhaps you could point out to where you're seeing it. I would also point out that there are two kinds of bars. There's the bar sporting rifle made by Browning, and there's the bar machine gun from World War I era. So perhaps there's some confusion there as well.
Well, maybe the confusion, maybe let's clarify. The amendment before us too is also G4. And are you familiar with the G4 amendment?
That's the one that speaks to centerfire semi-automatic rifles?
Yes, a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun that is capable of discharging centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner and that is designed to accept a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity greater than 5 cartridges of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. So I'm asking about G4, and that's a very all-inclusive amendment, just that paragraph alone. It's open-ended, it could really add any firearm in the future, and that's what we're looking for the interpretation today, right? Is it on the list? Because, we're looking for a definitive answer from you, Mr. Smith or Mr. Daly, about are these going to be captured in this new list of prohibited hunting rifle bans that the Prime Minister has laid before us?
The schedules 1 and Schedule 2, are not connected in any way to the proposed amendment you were referring to earlier about centerfire semi-automatic rifles. They operate completely independently. So the firearms that are listed on Schedule 1 are the firearms which are already prohibited, either in the 1990s or in 2020. Yep. On Schedule 2, it's firearms that the government has proposed become prohibited if the bill passes, and those lists are curated. They are produced manually, and there's the.
So you're saying kind of what you're leading people to believe, and maybe I shouldn't say that. I'll have you answer the question. Some of the firearms I've already spoken about fall into that G4 category in that paragraph, to be potentially prohibited if this legislation passes under C21. And are you saying that they're not going to be impacted by this legislation, or are you saying that they are going to be impacted by the legislation?
I'm saying neither. What I said was, in your response to the question were they on the list, I answered whether they were on the list or not. The impact of the evergreening clause, the semi-automatic centerfire clause that you mentioned earlier, was not part of the question and not part of the answer either. Okay.
Well, let's keep going, because I think we're looking for clear answers today, and we're still not getting them. I think law-abiding firearms owners know that they're going to be included by that paragraph, and for you to kind of say, well, no.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, point of order.
Mr. Van Bynen, point of order, please.
Statements made by the member are speculative. The amendments or any changes that might be contemplated for that schedule have not been dealt with, as been mentioned earlier. So it's an inappropriate comment.
Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Van Bynen. I would remind Mr. Zimmer that G46 has not been moved. Yeah. We are on debate on G4, so carry on.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. The Ruger number 1 hunting firearm. Is that firearm going to be added to the prohibited list if legislation C21 passes with amendments?
The Ruger number 1 already appears in Schedule 1, and it's been on that list since May of 2020. So there's nothing new coming from C21.
Yeah.
It's just being repeated in a schedule as opposed to being in the regulations. However, I would also point out that it's only those versions of the Ruger number 1 rifle which are chambered for a caliber which is capable of producing 10,000 joules of energy or more. It's listed in paragraph 95 of the existing regulations and of the proposed Schedule 1. So ordinary with calibers.
I have to keep moving. I know some of my colleagues want to ask questions today too, so I'm going to try and make the answers more concise. The fact of the matter is that the Ruger number 1 is a hunting rifle, and it now will be prohibited as a result of
that would not be correct.
So let's go on to the next.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I was not.
Mr. Nur Mohammed on point of order.
If we can ask the witness to repeat his answer, because Mr. Zimmer was speaking over his answer, I couldn't hear what he had to say, and if we could just get clarity there, please.
Actually, it's my time, Mr. Chair.
It's the committee's time. If the committee is not hearing the answer, I would certainly invite the witness to state it again, and maybe a little more loudly.
The question, as I understood it to be, was about the Ruger No. 1 rifle and whether it was prohibited. And my answer is that some Ruger No. 1 rifles are prohibited, in particular those ones which are chambered for a caliber which is capable of producing 10,000 joules of energy or more. Versions of the Ruger No. 1 rifle which are chambered for ordinary hunting calibers of the type that someone would use in Canada for hunting deer or moose, the version of the Ruger No. 1 chambered for those calibers would not be prohibited. And in general, if it would be non-restricted.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Another point of order, Mr. Chair. Sorry, and this is sincere, not to interrupt Mr. Zimmer. Is it me or
Mr. Mohammed on point of order.
Sorry, is it me or is it actually hard to hear? It is hard to hear, right? Okay. Okay. Is there any way we can turn? Excuse me. Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks. I thought I'm losing my hearing or something.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's go on to the next hunting rifle, the Mossberg 702 Plinkster 22 long rifle. Will that hunting and target shooting firearm, will it be prohibited as a result of C-21 legislation?
No, the Model 702 Plinkster is a conventional 22 caliber hunting rifle. It's unaffected by what's in C-21.
Okay. I'll go on to the next firearm. The hunting rifle, the Wesley Richards Model 1897. Is that firearm prohibited as a result of this legislation and associated amendments?
For that particular rifle, whether it's prohibited or not depends on the caliber it's chambered for. If that particular rifle is available in large African big game calibers, and some of which will exceed 10,000 joules, those versions of the rifle would be prohibited. Versions of it chambered for ordinary hunting calibers would not be prohibited. And I would further point out that this is no change from May of 2020.
And I just would acknowledge, and you would, sorry, I won't ask what you would say. I'll just say what I say. That is a hunting rifle, and it now will be prohibited as a result of the legislation. I'll go on to the next.
Only those versions which produce.
But it's still a hunting rifle that will be prohibited.
Let's let the witnesses answer, please. I'm sorry, I missed your answer.
Mr. Chair, just let me clarify, because my understanding of committee is that the member has the ability to ask questions, and it's our time is very precious, and I'm trying to get through these as quickly as I can, even with the delays, because I know other colleagues would like to speak to this. My understanding is when I'm asking questions, that is the member's time. Maybe just clarify.
So all members are here to facilitate the study that the committee has undertaken. You're absolutely free to ask questions, providing they're on topic. But it's also required that we give due respect and consideration to the witnesses, and we should, if we ask them a question, we should hear their answers and not talk over them. So, Mr. Mohammed on point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Can we also, as we're having these deliberations, and Mr. Zimmer is asking excellent questions, no question about that, can we also ensure that when the witness is giving an answer that people do not mischaracterize the answer that the witness has given in a statement and not give the witness a chance to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohammed. So did the witness wish to clarify his last response at all?
I can repeat the answer. The Wesley Richards rifle is available in calibers which exceed 10,000 joules of energy. Those versions would be prohibited. Versions which are chambered for ordinary hunting calibers would not be prohibited, and in general would be non-restricted.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Let's go on to the next hunting firearm, the Winchester Model 54. Will that be prohibited as a result of the passing of C-21 and associated amendments?
The Model 50, Winchester Model 54 is not on any of the schedules. There is the potential for it to be impacted by the evergreen clause, however.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. The next hunting firearm, the Parker breech-loading shotgun. Is that going to be included in the prohibited list based on the passing of C-21 and associated amendments?
The Parker is a brand name, and they make a variety of shotguns, and as was the case with the other firearms you mentioned, some of them are available in large calibers which exceed 10,000 joules energy. Those versions would be prohibited. In the case of the Parker, which is a shotgun, it's more likely that the shotgun would be available in 8 gauge. And with a barrel of that size, it would exceed 20 millimeters and be prohibited for that reason. But Parker shotguns, which are chambered for ordinary hunting calibers like 10 gauge or 12 gauge or 20 gauge, etc., would be unaffected and would remain non-restricted.
Once again, though, another hunting firearm being included in the prohibition list. Another question, the 𝐂𝐿𝐴 Farquharson 4 shotgun, will it be included as a result of the passing of C-21 and associated amendments?
It's the same situation where only those which are equipped with a barrel bigger than 10 gauge, so 8 gauge being the most common, which would exceed 20 millimeters and fall within the already existing paragraph 96 that's been there since 2020. So most of the shotguns would be unaffected, but the high energy or the large caliber ones would.
So once again, another hunting firearm being included.
It is a hunting firearm, but it's only prohibited in certain limited circumstances.
Yeah, still a hunting firearm though. The Charles Daly XT3 Classic Black Ranger, will it be prohibited as a result of the passing of C-21 and associated amendments?
And I don't recall whether that firearm is on the existing list or not.
It would be captured by the paragraph in G4 that talks about center fire, magazine capacity, and
okay. And what was the name of the firearm again, please?
The Charles Daly XT3 Classic Black Ranger. I could show you an image, but I'm not supposed to.
Yeah, no, I don't recall the specifics of that firearm.
Okay.
If you were to provide more information or allow me to
Okay.
look it up, I could respond.
I can do that following, happy to. Let's go to the next one, the NX-18, and it's a hunting rifle. I have an image of it right in front of me. It's actually a automatic or semi-automatic shotgun. It's a 410. Will it be? It's a hunting shotgun. Most of us have used 410s for grouse hunting, etc. Would the NX-18 semi-automatic 410 shotgun be included as a result of the passing of C-21 and associated amendments?
And again, I have to point out, I don't have every make and model memorized. I don't recall whether that shotgun has a detachable magazine or a fixed magazine. If it has a fixed magazine, it's unaffected. If it has a detachable magazine, it might be, but I'd need to look up the particulars for that particular shotgun.
But certainly has the capability, I think, and that's what's concerning many Canadians watching today. If it has the capability of having a detachable magazine, they will be included in paragraph G of G4.
Well, detachable magazines for shotguns is relatively uncommon even these days. So it's more likely that a shotgun that's designed for hunting would have a tubular fixed magazine and therefore would be unaffected.
The thing is, though, this is where the confusion is, and you're an expert. I know quite a bit about firearms, too. There's even confusion amongst us of whether it will be or not. And the capability, I think, is the key language. And if something's capable in the future of being deemed a certain way, this is, again, affecting firearms and hunters across this country. I'll keep going because I know time
just
is...
a point of order. Again, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Bynen on a point of order, please.
There's so much speculation here that we should be looking at also is that there's the potential that certain of these weapons could be restricted in the future. So to suggest that it's going to be captured is all premature, and to suggest that it's going to be included in the list, we haven't dealt with the list yet. So why don't we wait until we deal with the list? And I would suggest that we request to the member provide amendments if there are weapons that he feels that should not be included on the list, rather than just standing here and sitting here and speculating. I think our committee's time could be put to better use.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. I would remind Mr. Zimmer that this amendment has not yet been moved, that we are debating G4, not G46.
Actually, I'm just referring to G4 in this last firearm. And I guess just in answer to that, the question from the member, this is the onus is really on the government that's putting forward this legislation and the amendments included to really prove your case without a shadow of a doubt that certain firearms are not included on the list. And that's what I'm trying to do today. And I'm trying to give Canadians a good impression based on expert testimony at the end of the table, whether they will be or not. And you can see by the definition that, and it's speculative, but based on that definition, they certainly could be. And the capacity, that opens up a whole bunch of firearms that they're not on the G46, but they certainly will be included as a result of paragraph G and G4. So let me keep going.
Yeah, just a point of order, Mr.
Van Bynen,
rather than speculate and suggest, why don't we have some suggestions and recommendations that would solve this, and this would be far more productive use of our time.
Thank you, Mr.
Any
Van
recommendations to make amendments would be appreciated.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. We'll let Mr. Zimmer carry on.
Well, I'll answer that question. The easy answer is repeal C-21. Pull the legislation. There it is. That solves everybody's problem here. So anyway, I'll move on. So the Remington 870 DM shotgun, it's a semi-automatic shotgun with a detachable clip that is at times used for hunting. Will this firearm be included in the prohibited list of C-21 and associated amendments?
So I would, once again, so when you're talking about a list, we haven't got a list, G4, and associated amendments is pretty broad. It's kind of hard for anybody to answer these questions this way. I really encourage you to drill into the definition. It would be very helpful, I think. And anyway, I certainly don't want to impede your inquiry, but I really would encourage you to focus on G4.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chair, it is directly speaking to G4 in that particular paragraph. So anyway, can we have the answer from the firearms experts, please?
My recollection is that the Remington Model 870 shotgun is a pump-action shotgun.
I'm asking about the semi-automatic variant of that particular firearm.
If such a thing exists, the definition would apply.
I could show you the image, but I know it's...
Yeah. The definition would apply to the shotgun if it were semi-automatic and centerfire and had a detachable magazine, which it appears to be the case, and that the capacity of that magazine exceeded 5 cartridges. So if the shotgun meets all of those criteria, then it would be prohibited if that particular amendment passes in its existing form. Those factors are all relatively easy for anyone to assess.
Mm-hmm. I guess the concern is with those, and I've had an 870 Marine Magnum. We used to go fishing back in the backcountry in BC, and I used to pack that just in case a grizzly bear came upon us as we were fishing. The concern is around this one. It's obvious that it is included based on the definition, but the concern for many firearms owners across Canada is the variant option. So based on that, it is the basis of the gun or the firearm is an 870, a well-known a firearm that's been in probably most farmers' gun vault over the last 100 years. The concern is that, okay, this one might be included, but what about all the variants? And that would put many of the shotguns under this prohibition.
Well, previously we were talking about the evergreening definition, And the variant or modified version clause is not applicable to that definition. The variant or modified version applies only to the schedules. And the Remington Model 870 does not appear on the schedules anywhere. So there are no variants which would be affected now or in the future.
So are you saying that the Remington 870 DM won't be prohibited?
Well, I'm not in a position to restrict what any future government would do. What I'm saying is that
based on G4 and that paragraph G.
G4 is the evergreening definition. The evergreening definition would apply to any future model if the manufacturer of the firearm were to make it in such a way that it met the criteria of that definition.
Okay, I'll keep going. So another firearm to ask you about. The Ruger PC carbine takedown hunting rifle, will it be included if legislation C-21 and proposed amendments passes? Yes or no?
First of all, I wouldn't characterize the PC carbine as a hunting rifle. The PC, my recollection is it stands for police carbine. It's a small semi-automatic carbine that has a standard magazine size, I believe, of just under 20 cartridges, 17 perhaps. I'd have to look up to be sure. But as such, it would meet the evergreening definition in that it is semi-automatic. It fires a centerfire cartridge. It has a detachable magazine, and the capacity of that magazine exceeds 5 shots. So that firearm would be captured by that definition if it were to come into force.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Let's go on to the HOA 1500 Hogue bolt-action rifle, hunting rifle. Will that particular firearm, if C-21 passes with associated amendments, will it be prohibited?
It could be prohibited if it's in a caliber large enough to exceed 10,000 joules, but I think the likelihood of it for that particular firearm is limited, so probably not, but it could be, but only in the offending
It is
calibers.
on the current, it is on the G46. I know we're talking about G4 and G46 is out there, but
Yeah,
it's on there.
And
So-
to the extent that it's on, it would only be where it's chambered for the high energy cartridges. I believe you'd find it, if it's listed, it would be in paragraph 95,
Okay.
which is, that's been there since May of 2020. There's no change in what's before the committee today.
Okay, how about the Weatherby Mark 1, 2, or 5 hunting rifle, a very common hunting rifle in Canada? We spoke with Weatherby yesterday. There's been 1,000 that have just been ordered by hunters this year and distributed amongst retailers. Will those be prohibited if C-21 legislation and associated amendments pass?
The Weatherby Mark 5 is available in a high energy caliber, known as 460 Weatherby Magnum. So Weatherby rifles chambered for that caliber would be prohibited because the energy exceeds 10,000 joules. However, Weatherby offers the firearms in a wide variety of calibers, most of which are below the 10,000 joule threshold, and those would have the same classification as they do today, which is typically non-restricted.
And I guess I'll bring this up once again, is the concern out in the firearms community and the hunting community and hunters across Canada is that will it be somehow associated based on that it's a variant of the particular caliber that you mentioned, and by being a variant, will it be included? And I guess that isn't clear, and that's why we're getting so many questions about it.
Yes, well, the prohibited versions of the Weatherby Mark V would be that way because they're chambered for a high energy caliber, and paragraph 95 applies, and paragraph 95 does not follow the same conventions as the other paragraphs in the regulations. There is no variant or modified version clause in that paragraph, so there is no question of any future variants whatsoever.
So I guess back to the original question, that is the Mark 1, 2, or 5 hunting rifle on the prohibited list, and you've answered yes.
Yes, the Weatherby rifles would be prohibited only if they happen to be chambered for a caliber that exceeds 10,000 joules of energy.
Okay. another question on a competition rifle. The FNAR Competition 308 rifle. It's a semi-automatic. It's chambered in centerfire calibers. Will this particular firearm be included in the prohibition list if C-21 and associated amendments pass?
Well, that particular rifle is already prohibited. It's been prohibited since circa 1992 or 1995 in the original regulations, which you would find in Schedule 1. So there's no change there. The FNFL family is all prohibited.
Well, I guess it's interesting because that particular firearm is available for sale today. And I've seen it, and I'll show you. Again, I'd like to hold up a picture, but I can't.
Are you sure it's an FNFL, sir?
FNAR.
Maybe I didn't hear it correctly.
Yeah,
So
FNAR.
an FNAR. Okay, that's a different gun. That's not an FNFL. So
Yeah, no, it's an FNAR.
Yeah, so that's a firearm that is a blend of the FNFL and AK-47. It's not explicitly on any of the older lists, the Schedule 1. I would have to check to see if it's on Schedule 2. Just
Yeah,
excuse me one
well,
moment.
and just to clarify too, Mr. Smith, this is in reference to paragraph G in G4 and falls under that definition by just observation.
Oh, yes, it would fall within the bounds of that particular definition because it is a rifle. It is semi-automatic. It fires a centerfire cartridge, and it has a detachable magazine, and the magazine size is vary up to about 30 shots. So yes, it would be captured.
Okay. I've asked quite a few questions about firearms, and my colleagues will likely have more to ask. And again, it's all to do with C-21 in the legislation, but it's going to take a little bit there's a different question. And if you can't answer that, I respect that. My question is, and I think Canadians are wondering too, because I think Canadians want to be safer. And I think with this legislation, the Prime Minister has led people to believe that it will make them safer. But in capturing hunters and their hunting rifles, we know that hunters are not the problem when it comes to crime in Canada. We all know that in this room. I'm going to be bringing up an article that speaks to that. But maybe I'll ask you your opinion. Are hunting rifles the problem when it comes to public safety in Canada?
Well, that's a policy issue that is best answered by public safety. I'm here to answer technical questions.
Okay. Well, let me just refer to an article in National Post from September 6th. And this is, again, kind of answers the question I've just asked. What is the problem? Most of the crime guns seized in Toronto are smuggled into Canada from U.S. It says, police is the response. And so the quote is, and it's relevant because this is what was a statement that was made before a Public Safety Committee. Most laws, and this is from police chiefs directly. Most laws we create are not going to be followed by people committing crimes with guns, said Regina Police Chief Evan Bray. We have a ban on murder in Canada, and yet sadly, we still have homicides. Toronto Deputy Chief Marianne 𝐷 testified 86%, and remember that number, 86% of the crime guns were smuggled into Canada.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, point of order.
Mr. Van Bynen, on a point of order, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I thought we invited these experts in for technical advice. If we want to have some political commentary, we could do that another time. Our time is better spent asking the experts on firearms the technical questions that they were invited here for.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Zimmer may be just debating. I hope that if that would not be a question you could really address to these witnesses, but you can certainly bring these matters up as a matter of debate.
Yeah, I'll continue on. So the Toronto Deputy Chief Marianne 𝐷 testified 86% of crime guns were smuggled into Canada. Blandford said facing the nearly insurmountable task of securing Canada's porous borders and coastlines, It's not surprising Ottawa went after low-hanging fruit of punishing gun owners, and that's why I'm bringing it up today, because that's what we're talking about. Legal gun owners go through a rigorous process to be vetted to own a firearm, he said. Legitimate gun owners, whether they're handgun or long rifle, are probably amongst the most law-abiding citizens in the country. They are not the problem. And the reason I bring that up today, this is why we're here today, was talking about C-21, a bill that's supposed to make us more safe, by tackling the wrong element. It's going after law-abiding firearms owners and their firearms, their hunting firearms. But let me go on to talk about what the problem is. And it's very relevant to this conversation because, again, the C-21 is meant to address this very question. So what is the problem? Illegal guns, as I've just laid out, coming across the border are the problem. 86%, according to the Toronto Deputy Chief Marianne. 86% of those firearms used that are killing our kids on the streets of Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal are coming from across the border. Okay? So then what can we do about it? I'm just going to talk about how many firearms were seized at the border. The number of firearms, this is another article from CTV, July 2022, and it speaks to these guns as they're coming across. The number of firearms Canada seized at the border more than doubled last year from 1,110 to 1,110 from 495 in 2020. The highest total since at least 2016, according to the numbers provided to Reuters at the Canada's Border Service Agency. And these are the only ones that they've seized. How many guns pour across our border and end up into criminals' hands and that are, again, killing our kids? It goes on. Gun violence in Toronto, Canada's most populous city, reached a 15-year high in 2019 with 492 incidents involving firearms, according to police data. That number fell following 2 years, but 2022 is on track to rise once again. So that's the problem. And yet this government brings in C-21 and brings in even a further amendment to even punish law-abiding firearms owners even more. But I'd like to, so the cost of what C-21 is going to cost Canadians. I think it's going to be relevant in my final point. Because we know that even the previous long gun registry that once again targeted law-abiding firearms owners was promised it was going to cost $2 million, ended up costing $2 billion. So what is the estimate? Well, I'll read an article from an expert. He's a Simon Fraser professor. Trudeau government buyback firearms plan may cost up to $6.7 billion. And that's prior to this latest G46 amendment being laid on this committee's table. So I'll quote.
Just as point of reference, the G47 has not yet been laid on this committee's table. And this is good commentary, but it really doesn't pertain to G4.
It's relevant to C-21 though, Mr. Chair. It's completely relevant. And so the $6.7 billion, it says this range.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Nur Mohammed on point of order.
Is it not, should we not, are the questions not to be germane to the specific clause up for discussion?
The debate is supposed to be on G4, and it's very, Mr. Zimmer can bring it back at some point and
absolutely.
Render that satisfied. But I'm just encouraging him to do so.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because when G4 and C21 will be implemented, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's what the cost is going to cost the Canadians. And I'm going to get to not just the cost, because I think people would say we're willing to pay a price as long as it makes it safe. But what I'm arguing, this isn't making us more safe. So the range estimate rises between $2.6 billion and $6.7 billion after you include compensation costs to owners. And again, this same author has said with the addition of this potential new amendment being added, it adds another $1 billion. So easily between, and Ms. Dancho knows this too well, between 5 and 10 billion, pretty easy by the time it's all said and done. So for those mums of kids in our inner cities, and I'm a father of 4, you know, I want to see our streets more safe. We know that violent crime has increased by 33% under this Prime Minister and government. We know that gang crime has increased by 92% since this government took office. So what they're doing isn't working. And this is another bill put forward that's got the image or sort of the facade that it will do something when it really won't. So we know that the cost is going to be between $5 and $10 billion. So what could $5 to $10 billion do in a positive way, instead of going after law-abiding firearms owners and hunters in Canada? Well, simple math, even if, let's pick the lower amount, let's pick $5 billion as the amount that we're going to calculate this on. If we added, based on an average salary and training for the average police officer, CBSA agent, at $150,000, we could put 10,000 officers on the streets for about 4 years. And so just imagine those containers that we hear there's one in every 100 that actually gets inspected at the border where we know the problem is. Imagine putting another 5,000 CBS agents at the borders to capture these guns before they get across to gang members in our inner cities. Just imagine. Or as my colleague, Mr. Calkins, has even informed me, is that the equipment that we could give those border agents to completely scan every container, we could easily pay for the manpower and the equipment to up our game at the borders dramatically to reduce the guns coming across. So why aren't we doing that? Something that will have a real impact. And I guess in a positive way too. Ultimately, this ends up on the streets as seeing firearms that are and crime that's hurting our kids. We see the crime rates are spiking and getting worse. And by the list that I've read out earlier today, it's not comprehensive, even Mr. Smith, as you acknowledge. Paragraph G really opens it up to a whole bunch of other hunting firearms potentially. And all for almost zero effect when we know that 86% of those firearms that are killing our kids are coming across the border. They're not coming from law-abiding hunters in my community, that's for sure. So my final point is we know that hunters are not the problem. We know what the problem is. And knowing what the problem is, how about we put that huge amount of money in a place that it'll actually work and keep our communities safe? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We go now to Mr. Calkins. Mr. Calkins represents my hometown, by the way, so welcome.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Mr. Chair.
I said you have the floor. I just mentioned that you represent my hometown. So.
Yes, I do. We've had that conversation before. So thank you, Chair. And so I'm just going to make some introductory remarks as the Shadow Minister for Hunting, Fishing and Conservation and His Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And then I'll get to some of the questions that I have for our esteemed witnesses. You know, Canada, once a refuge for the rugged individual, we would be hard-pressed to make a case for that for Canada today. Since 1850, urbanization has swept the country, practically inverting the population of urban dwellers and rural residents. Today, nearly 80% of Canadians live in an urban area. As noted by one of the members opposite, Canada has changed. Although he is not entirely wrong in his assessment, in this process of change, many aspects of this country have been improved. However, blind nostalgia does us no favors. Yet as different as the country looks today compared to the one the traveler would have found in 1850, this does not mean that all traces of this old Canada ought to be erased. For those Canadians and First Nations who live in remote areas or participate in the outdoor way of life, their lived reality is a different one than those who keep the most populated or live in the most populated parts of our nation. As you can imagine, life in places like Pond Inlet in Nunavut, Ignace, Ontario, Sept-Îles, Quebec, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, or Prince Rupert, British Columbia, resemble nothing of the urban experience in downtown Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. One should note that the prevalence of firearms licenses per 100 people is the highest in Yukon, for a rate of 19.17% 1 in 5 Yukonners has a firearm, compared to the national average of just under 6%, thus indicating a wide swing in licenseship ownership in certain parts of the country. It may come as a surprise to the members opposite, but those participating in the hunting lifestyle are surprisingly diverse. The hunters of today are not your trappers of the early fur trade, which, by the way, is an essential part of our history and the basis of modern commerce in our nation. Hunting is a genuine family-oriented activity enjoyed by those of all creeds and ethnic backgrounds, where the wisdom of past generations is passed down to the new. I am here at committee today because with Bill C-21, the federal government has, whether it wants to admit it or not, basically said to hunters that your way of life is going to be no more. Guns are not weapons of war, as some politicians would like to have you believe, but an essential harvesting tool used for hunters to feed their families. It provides food security in our northern and remote communities, and I've heard scoffing and other rhetoric from other politicians indicating that this way of life is not even needed in a modern Canada. And I take particular offense in the carelessness and what appears to be the carelessness of the drafting of not only this bill, but of the proposed amendments that are before it. It is clear to me that Bill 71 is not based on science at all. It is not based on any evidence at all. But it is a simple political decision, and the problem with this is it tarnishes the time-honored traditions of firearms owners and sport shooters in this country, hunters included. It tarnishes the reputations, sullies the reputations of these good, honest, law-abiding, patriotic Canadians. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a proponent of naturalism, once stated that the only true freedom was found in nature alone, and that one must remain close to nature and its inherent liberty and equality. It is Rousseau that created the concept of the social contract, to counter the loss of freedom brought on by man's move away from the inherent freedom of nature. He believed that a man's participation in what he called unnatural collective activities infringed on his liberty, and as such, a bargain called the social contract had to be struck. The purpose of the social contract, made by sacrificing some individual freedom for state protection and cooperative benefits, lays out the obligations of government towards its subjects. Although we can argue about what these consist of, John Locke, another contributor to the theory of social contracts, explained it best when he said, "Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Bill C-21 is a piece of legislation that breaks this social contract. Beyond the obvious point of liberty, it also infringes on both the right to possess guns themselves and a right to personal health and freedom. This may all seem academic, but fear not. I'm about to present some real-world concrete examples of what the infringement on the Canadian social contract means for the hunting community. Canadians have a reasonable right to own their possessions. One of the foundational pillars of the social contract, private property lies at the heart of many democratic systems. We know this to be true, as even though it is not enshrined in our legislation, that Canada is a signatory to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes that everyone has the right to own property, and provides that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her property. Arbitrary is an important word in this context, as Bill C-21 does exactly this. Not only is the classification of firearms in Amendment G4 and G46E arbitrary, but the lack of buyback or any provisions hinting at a buyback is proof of how little the government regards the concept of property rights. It is also striking to me that many of these guns included on the list of firearms are not solely semi-automatic as intended by the legislation and as advertised by the Prime Minister, but many are bolt-action rifles and shotguns, including the likes of the Winchester Model 54, Weatherby Mark V, the Kimber 89 African, and the Montana Rifle 1999. These are not military rifles that later became popular as hunting arms, but were designed explicitly for the purpose of hunting. A separate point I would like to make is the availability of both firearms and ammunition in northern communities. Access to firearms in northern communities is already limited and can be hard to come by in the make and model desired by hunters. Notwithstanding COVID supply chain issues, there has been a long-running difficulty in supplying the North with these items. In fact, Canada Post will no longer ship ammunition, and now with this ban replacing with this proposed ban, if it comes into force, replacing these banned firearms will be difficult for First Nations and Inuit in an already stretched market. By instituting such a wide-ranging ban, the Liberal government will make it difficult for these hunters to replace their firearms. Yet these people are the likeliest to perform sustenance hunting, endangering a critical method of ensuring food security in a harsh environment where groceries come at an irregular pace and with high prices. Lastly, I would like to focus on how our new gun laws will affect the tourism sector. Hunters inbound from abroad, especially the United States, contribute significantly to our hunting sector and keep our lodges and outfitters busy. And I might add that for the last 2 years of COVID-19, guides and outfitters and lodges have been some of the most hardest hit in the tourism sector. And I can tell you, as a hunter, that these tourists often prefer to take their own firearms, as not only will they be more ergonomic, but also have the added safety benefit of the hunter knowing his own firearm. By depriving foreign tourists of their reasonable hunting rifles, as proposed, will happen, I can assure you it will happen with the evergreening clause, as it's referred to, and with the schedule list of firearms. This will result in just yet another blow to the guides and outfitters and lodges across our country. As for the health component of the social contract, it is clearly violated by Bill C-21. Those closest to the natural world, for example, our rural Canadians and hunters, are the most impacted by the loss of liberty engendered by an increasingly urbanized society. They are also the ones most vulnerable to the loss of their physical well-being due to the prohibition of their tools and property. As previously mentioned, this bill may in fact affect food security, yet there is also a physical health component to firearms debate that is not often discussed, that of workers in remote areas. In some parts of our country and in some industries, firearms are vital to one's physical safety. In this scenario, firearms are actually used for self-defense. Tour operators operating in the north need to ensure that their guests are protected from polar bears and other wildlife. They have a duty of care to protect their guests. When beekeepers go out into remote areas to collect honey from their hives, it is not uncommon at all for a beekeeper to be caught unaware by a lingering bear. This is a completely different scenario than a hunter who is walking through the woods carrying his or her firearm, ready at a moment's notice to pursue the hunt. These are people who find themselves in a defensive position. These are people who need to be able to react and respond quickly because their primary focus and objective while they're working is not the same as the primary focus of somebody who is hunting. And I can tell you, without any hesitation whatsoever, that the ability to have a shotgun that would be caught up in the evergreening clause or on the schedule that is proposed in these amendments to Bill C-21 would take a vast number of firearms away from people who are just trying to defend themselves. I know beekeepers who carry with them a Tavor because it is compact, it has 5 rounds, it's chambered in .308, and it will stop a bear. And now this beekeeper is going to have his property rendered valueless, and he has to go and search for another firearm or shotgun that would have the similar capabilities of the Tavor, not knowing if Section G4 of this proposed legislation, of the amendment coming through, would in fact eventually get that new firearm caught up in the prohibited list. This violates the social contract between Canadians and their government, and it also potentially harms the health and safety and well-being of Canadians. I remember very vividly, because I have worked most of my life prior to coming to Parliament in the outdoor industry. I was a conservation officer for the province of Alberta, and I was a national park warden in Jasper National Park. I'm also a hunter. There are numerous reasons why people would have a semi-automatic firearm. Anybody working in the forestry industry, anybody who's done the job of timber cruising, where you're going down a cut line, determining whether or not a cut block is going to be productive or not for your forestry company, would carry with them a shotgun likely advertised by the manufacturer as a defender. It could be semi-automatic, it could be pump action, it would likely have a pistol grip, and it would likely be polymer plastic, or made out of polymer, and it would be black. and it would look to the untrained eye like a scary gun. But it is the firearm that would be best used and best positioned to provide the safety benefit to somebody's son or daughter, to somebody's brother or sister, to somebody's mom or dad who's working in the outdoor environment in a situation where they can be put at risk. Not to mention all of the hunters in this land. Not everybody who hunts with a firearm. There are bow hunters. And if you don't have the knowledge or experience of what it's like to sit in a tree stand and call or bugle for an elk or for a buck or for a bull moose, what you are also doing in that act is letting every predator in the woods know that you are there as well. It is not unreasonable at all for a bow hunter to have a safety firearm with them. It needs to be small and compact, otherwise it does not work in that scenario. I can tell you numerous firearms that are newly added to the list in the proposed amendments will now render firearms that were bought specifically for the purpose of personal protection by people who, either through their work or through their enjoyment of hunting, will now have their property rendered useless, if not worthless.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I haven't heard a question.
Mr. Van Bynen on a...
We have witnesses here, and I haven't heard a question yet. I'm wondering if we could...
I haven't heard a question by Mr. Van Bynen either.
Mr.
If he wants the floor, he can ask for it.
I haven't, Mr. Chair. I haven't asked for time to ask questions, but I'm here to hear have the benefit of the witnesses' information, particularly from a technical point of view. And if and when I do have a question, I will let the chair know.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. However, there's no obligation of the member to ask questions. The officials are here to provide answers if asked, but the member may certainly carry on his debate. It is related to G4, I believe, and please carry on.
Thank you, Chair. So before I get to the officials for questions, I would like to remind my colleagues opposite the two things that are often forgotten when talking about firearm bans. The opportunity cost expended when these excessive and ineffective gun control measures are put in place, and what little risk actually exists of being victimized by a law-abiding firearms owner. I asked my colleagues what kind of cost-benefit analysis has been conducted for this project, for the cost of the buyback, the last of which was not even completed yet. A host of measures could be purchased to actually improve public safety, as my colleague Mr. Zimmer has said. With the high estimate, or even just with a medium-term estimate of $5 billion, which is what the Fraser Institute said for the last buyback before we even included new firearms through the proposed amendments, we could make quick work of many outstanding needs. At a cost of $3 million US, that is how much the Grand Caymans just spent this year, $3 million for a shipping container scanning system, modern shipping container scanning system, $3 million. It doesn't just find firearms. It finds all contraband, including drugs. And in a nation of Canada where I believe we have 119 ports of entry, we convert 5 million Canadian dollars into US dollars. We could literally buy 10 of these scanning devices for every port of entry, rather than buying $5 million worth of firearms from law-abiding Canadians. Now you tell me, and to the Canadians who are watching, you tell me which is likely to have a larger impact on public safety. Being able to scan virtually every vehicle and every container that comes into our country, or taking property away that's sitting there idly in the lockers and vaults of everyday Canadians? I already know what the answer to that question is. Only 1% of containers currently passing through our ports of entry are scanned. That's it, 1%. We obviously need to improve this if we're going to stem the tide of illegal firearms moving north from our southern neighbor. Speaking of which, a large number of Border Patrol officers could also be hired to ensure a further reduction in cross-border smuggling. After all, Most of the guns used in urban gang shootings are smuggled in illegally at a staggering 85%, according to the Toronto Police. On the social services side of the things, we could surely throw in that $875 million that the Liberals promised in their last election campaign for mental health, which I would argue is probably at the root for most of the gun violence that we have in this country if somebody from the law-abiding community were to do this. So, how many times could we fund the mental health strategy that the Liberals haven't allocated a single dollar for, instead of potentially?
Point of order.
And I don't
again,
even
Mr. Chair, point of order. We're looking for
Mr.
relevance
Van
here.
Bynen, on a point of order?
I'm looking for relevance here with respect to the technical expertise that we've invited to this meeting. Still haven't heard any.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. But again, the technical expertise is there for the member to call upon if needed. But as long as the remarks are addressed to the bill and particularly to the motion, he's free to speak on whatever he likes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alternatively, if not invested in mental health, if not invested in purchasing scanners at our ports of entry, it would be surprising for Canadians to know that in Miramichi, New Brunswick, only 10% of the required background checks are conducted in the renewal or the application of a current firearms license, because it's not properly or adequately funded, Mr. Chair. So, these are all tangible, concrete things that would actually improve safety for Canadians, public safety for our country, with $5 billion worth of funding, which is what the Fraser Institute estimates what it would cost if the Government of Canada were to provide compensation to firearms owners should Bill C-21 and its amendments come to pass. On the perception of legal gun ownership contributing to crime, we know that simply isn't true. Under this government, the prevalence of violent crime is up 32%, and there is a fear that it will only get worse. In fact, the banning of certain firearms seems to be a political exercise, and there is a legitimate fear that the crime issue will be used by the government to ban even more lawful firearms. As we see from some of the amendments brought forth by the government, the list is not simply semi-automatics, but a wide swath of firearms. Despite the fact that handguns are used to commit the vast majority of violent crimes in Canada, long guns and shotguns are bearing the full brunt of this government's policies. Furthermore, firearm-related violent crime typically represents less than 3% of police-reported violent crime in Canada, a country where individuals own more than 20 million guns. Canadians have little to fear from law-abiding gun owners. Ironically, in the UK, during 2019-2020, nearly 16,000 knife crimes were committed in a nation with strict gun control. I will add that in comparison to Canada, the UK reported 33% more robberies, 22% more assaults, 30% more homicides, and 28% more hate crimes. Ironically, many of the European nations that are held up against Canada due to their tight gun control, including France, the UK, Belgium, Greece, and Sweden, fare much worse in their crime rate, and Germany is also comparable. Canada is not the United States, and it is not healthy to import their cultural issues for political gains. Every loss of life is a tragedy, but it does have to be put in perspective. A 2011 study from McMaster University found no significant association between gun laws passed and firearm homicide rates in Canada from 1974 to 2008, proving that the introduction of such laws within the Canadian context has been nothing more than a political exercise. While homicide-related deaths get much more of the attention within the context of firearms being used, many of the excess deaths are tied to suicides, yet this is still a very minimal number. On the accident front, firearms have also attracted unwanted attention, yet accidents account for 0.3% of total accident incidents, ranking well below 37% for transportation vis-a-vis car accidents, 18% for people falling off roofs or falling from distances, and 11% for poisoning. Yet nobody here is arguing that we should not drive cars. We are focusing so much time, so much effort, and so much money on something that is so insignificant, it's not even funny. To recapitulate, this is a bad law as it breaks the social contract that Canadians have struck with their government, come to a great expense, and will come to a great expense potentially for taxpayers of Canada and fails to improve public safety. Now that I've done my rant, Mr. Van Bynen, you'll be very happy to know that I have some questions. My questions for our panel of experts is there any province or territory in Canada that prohibits a hunter from hunting with a firearm in its provincial wildlife rules, laws, or regulations, prevents a hunter from hunting with a firearm that has a force of over 10,000 joules?
Not that I'm aware of.
So until this order in council and until these proposed amendments were made, it was completely legal to hunt in Canada with a rifle that produced a force of greater than 10,000 joules, correct?
If that firearm had been non-restricted prior to May 1st, 2020, or was not previously restricted in the classification regulations, then it would have been legal to use those firearms for hunting.
Weatherby, on its site, because Weatherby also makes much of its own ammunition, claims that the 460 and other large ammunition, powerful ammunition, I will call it, even if it's in 30 cal, says explicitly in their marketing that this ammunition is only good for animals up to about 2,000 pounds. Is there any animals in North America that are hunted lawfully, harvested lawfully, that are greater than 2,000 pounds?
Thank you for the question. I think this is outside of the scope that we as officials can provide answers to.
So can I ask the officials, had they conducted any research? Had they met with any hunting groups? Had they met with any northern hunting groups, for example, Inuit who hunt bowhead whales, narwhals, and belugas? Or anybody in the Yukon or northern Alberta where bison hunting is legal? Has the department reached out to any of these organizations to find out the impact of limiting hunting to calibers that produce joules less than 10,000 and what that might do for those people who are hunting large terrestrial or aquatic animals?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chang on a point of order.
Mr. Chair, the officials are here to answer technical questions, not about animals in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chang, and the point is taken. Certainly, our officials are today here to answer technical questions on the bill, on the amendment before us. So I would certainly encourage the member to.
I simply asked, Mr. Chair, if any of our technical experts are aware of any information that the Government of Canada has in consultations with anybody who hunts large terrestrial or aquatic mammals in this country, because it has a bearing to do on the 10,000 joules, which is part of the order in council from a few years ago and is wrapped up specifically in Bill C-21. It was perfectly legal, as the witnesses have already said, that hunting with those calibers and that ammunition was perfectly legal, and now it is not. And I'm wondering if anybody knows what the impact of that is going to be on the First Nations communities of this country or other people who hunt large terrestrial land animals. That's a perfectly legitimate question, Mr. Chair. I would like to know the answer if the officials have it.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the proposed amendments, in terms of your question with regards to 10,000 joules, those are already prohibited through the OIC. Therefore, there is no change of what is prohibited if this motion were to pass.
My question was actually, does the department have any information, any information that it can table with this committee of any scientific rationale for the purpose of hunting why a 10,000 joule rifle should not be allowed to be used in Canada?
So,
has any consultation been done with any of the groups that might be infected?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
And I just want to know if that information exists or if this was just an arbitrary
Mr.
decision.
Nur Mohammed on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I mean, it is clear that Mr. Calkins is aware of what happens when you shoot something with 10,000 joules. You obliterate the animal. You know that belugas and narwhals are hunted using regular hunting firearms, not 10,000 joule things, and bowhead whales are used using explosive devices. We are asking questions here of witnesses that is outside the scope of their expertise. They do not represent the entirety of the Government of Canada. I would really encourage you, Mr. Chair, to ensure that the questions are focused on the areas of expertise with which these witnesses have presented themselves and have been willing to offer their time.
I'm at a bit of debate there, but I take your point. The officials are really here. They can't comment on policy and on conjecture about what's going on behind the scenes, I believe. Anyway, carry on, Mr.
Well, as Mr.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Michaud, on a point of order.
Je pense que les questions de Monsieur Calkins.
I believe that Mr. Calkins' questions are relevant. And if the officials here cannot answer them, maybe we could ask the question to the proponent of the amendment. If I was to propose this amendment, I would have to explain what is my basis, for example, 10,000 joules. So maybe Mr. Chang could answer the question, because I have the same questions. And normally we ask those questions to the proponent of the amendment. So I will leave Mr. Calkins go ahead, but I believe that the government MPs maybe could answer those questions.
To Madame Michaud's point, Mr. Chang is not a witness. These are certainly matters that can be raised and asked in debate, absolutely. And perhaps at some point Mr. Chang would care to respond in debate as well. I'm sorry, there was another point of order?
Yeah,
Is that the same point of order?
I would just support Ms. Michaud's proposal, the proponent, to provide their opinion and evidence to answer that question. Thank you.
Well, once again, Mr. Chang is not a witness before this committee. He's a member of it, and it's not appropriate to, part of the process. Anyway, Mr. Calkins, if you please, carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I take it that the department doesn't have any information to share with the committee on any consultations that it's had with any of the hunting groups in Canada about whether or not the 10,000 joule limit is actually reasonable or not. Mr. Smith, would a 460 Weatherby, would any rifle chambered in a 460 Weatherby be prohibited as a result of the changes that are being proposed and going back to the Ordering Council?
The 460 Weatherby is a rifle made for a variety of purposes related to hunting. It is available in high energy calibers, those which exceed 10,000 joules, largely for hunting large African game. The rifle is also available in smaller calibers, which are typical of what would be used by hunters.
Okay, so my question for you is very technical then, because if we're taking a look at, say, a Ruger, let's take a look at the number. Well, I believe it's the number one. Many of these firearms have interchangeable barrels. Would you agree with my assessment?
Some firearms are modular. However, neither the Weatherby Mark V nor the Ruger number 1 are modular. Changing the barrels on either of those firearms is a major gunsmithing undertaking.
Let's use an example of a gun that does have a modular capacity that is currently prohibited. What would happen if somebody had one of those hunting firearms? They had a barrel that was for a 460, but they also had a 30-06 barrel for it. How would the law interpret that?
Our position or our interpretation of it is that in order for a firearm to be affected by the 10,000 joule provision, the firearm has to actually be chambered for that particular caliber.
But you're not banning the barrel, you're banning the entire firearm. Mr. Smith, explain to me how the law works. I have a similar question for you when it comes back to the G4, but so I'm simply talking about the barrel, not the rest of the firearm. If the barrel is changeable from a 30-06 to a 460 Weatherby,
the barrels for rifles in general are not regulated. So to be in possession of a barrel chambered for any caliber, be it one over 10,000 joules or not, is not regulated. The barrels are not a regulated commodity for rifles.
But yet the barrel is the one that's responsible for the caliber that it can shoot, correct?
It's one of the characteristics responsible, but also the bolt itself has to be compatible with the caliber. So the bolt face can change from one caliber to another.
Well, I would assume that a rifle manufacturer wouldn't provide barrels or wouldn't manufacture barrels for which the bolt was incompatible. That would make no sense. Would you agree?
Well, I agree in part. I understand your point. But the point I'm making is that if you change, say, a Weatherby Mark V rifle from a caliber, a smaller caliber, say, 338 Weatherby, to be chambered for 460 Weatherby, which is over 10,000 joules, it's necessary to change the barrel and the bolt.
In that particular example.
In that particular firearm.
But there are other firearms where you could change the barrels and get over the 10,000 joules, is there not?
It depends, again, on the exact circumstances, because there are...
So, okay, so let's just say, hypothetically, what does the law do to an owner of a gun, doesn't matter the make or model, the owner of a gun who has the ability to change the barrel to a caliber that can exceed 10,000 joules and to a barrel that doesn't exceed 10,000 joules, what happens to that individual's firearm?
In my experience, the firearm would be prohibited only if it is actually, the rifle is actually chambered for the high energy caliber, and there's a parallel to that exists in law today. There's a provision under the restricted firearms definition for firearms which become restricted if they have a barrel length under 470 millimeters, plus other technical considerations. And the firearm is considered restricted only if it has the short barrel on and not if it doesn't. So that's an exact parallel to the situation you're describing. And the way the courts have dealt with that is to consider what the firearm actually has mounted in order to assess its classification. So I don't think there's anything in particular for an owner of the type that you described who happens to have a spare barrel in a caliber that's over 10,000 joules.
What are you going to do when Weatherby loads their 460 Weatherby to produce 9,999 joules?
The way the definition is framed in Section 95 speaks to capable rather than actual. And so downloading the caliber would not change things. The firearm is still capable of receiving a standard 460 Weatherby and therefore would continue to be prohibited.
Is every semi-automatic rifle that's capable of accepting a legal magazine capable of accepting an illegal magazine if it's manufactured for that rifle?
Yes.
So that would mean that G4 means every semi-automatic rifle with a
Mr.
centerfire
Calkins, please let
cartridge in
the
this
witness
country
answer.
is now illegal?
No, I would not agree with that because the magazine capacity is not linked to the classification of the firearm.
Oh no, it's a friendly conversation, Mr.
I understand, but we're not hearing the answers that the witness is giving. So
okay,
I encourage the lively debate, but I would like to hear the answers.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you, Chair.
Under the present law, magazines and firearms are classified independently. We have magazine regulations which determine which magazines are lawful and which are not. And we also have
I understand that. I understand that, Mr. Smith. You're right. I agree with you. I'm not disputing that. But the evergreening clause in G4 actually doesn't speak to magazines. It speaks to the rifle, and if the rifle is capable.
That's correct. That would be a change in the way things operate with respect to that.
Oh yeah, that's
provision.
a big change, Mr. Smith. Yeah, I would agree with you.
And so firearms which meet the criteria of that definition. So the firearm in question must be a rifle or a shotgun, must be semi-automatic, must have a detachable magazine, and the capacity of that magazine must exceed 5 shots.
No, that's not what the law says, Mr. Smith. It doesn't say that the magazine has to have more. It says it's capable of receiving a magazine that contains more than 5. That is a capability issue, not a definition of how many shots are legal in a magazine. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. It is, you're correct in that assessment, that if the firearm is capable of accepting a magazine that exceeds 5 shots, then it would fall into the prohibited category. That's limited somewhat by language that limits
Do you need a license to buy a magazine?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
The witness was in the middle of...
Mr. No, on a point of
The
order.
witness was literally in the middle of explaining what the caveat was, and Mr. Calkins cut him off. Can we please have the witness finish the answer so we can hear what he was trying to say?
On the same point of order?
Yes, can we please have the government across the way keep interrupting our questioning?
That's
And
not
we'll
the
get
same
to
point
the
of order.
answers.
So I would certainly appreciate the witness being able to finish his answer.
Yes, I was just looking at the actual definition there, and it does not actually use the word capable. It uses the word designed. So your point is partially correct in that the classification of the rifle or the shotgun is influenced by the kind of magazines it's designed to accept. But but the use of the word capable is somewhat broader than that.
Could I clarify the drafting of the provision as well? There seems to be a misunderstanding that the design to accept a cartridge magazine means that it is limited, that it applies to any cartridge magazine over 5. And the phrasing of the provision says of more than 5 cartridges, and then what follows afterwards says of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. And the design to accept clause was drafted to refer to the magazine that was originally designed for that firearm by the manufacturer.
Well, with all due respect, Madam Clarke, the second word in that clause is a firearm. That is a rifle or shotgun. It's not talking explicitly about magazines.
So it says a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun. Then it goes on to say that is capable of discharging semi-automatic ammunition, discharging centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner. And then the third category, the third requirement, is that that firearm is designed to accept a detachable magazine with a capacity of greater than 5 magazines. And then with the final clause, of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. So that means that the magazine cartridge was, the firearm and the magazine cartridge were designed together by the manufacturer. And so compatibility with the third-party manufacturer magazine beyond the original design intent of that firearm would not render that firearm prohibited. That firearm would not be prohibited according to this definition. And what this does, I haven't finished, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
What this would do is that it establishes like a stable classification of these firearms, and that it's unaffected by third-party manufacturers of magazine cartridge magazines.
With the greatest of respect, Madam Clarke, most of the firearms that are capable of receiving a magazine are designed. There is nothing different about the feeding mechanism of a magazine when it feeds a round of ammunition into the chamber. There is nothing different about it, whether it can hold 5 rounds or 7 rounds. There is no requirement under Canadian law at all to have a license. Anybody can go into any store and purchase a magazine for a rifle without a firearms license. Am I correct?
You're correct.
So, what this means, in my interpretation, even though I appreciate your clarification, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the fact that we don't have any restrictions on magazines at all in this country, other than if they're going to be used, they have to be pinned to 5. You would agree with that statement, right?
I agree with that statement.
But that's not what this, I know that's what you're trying to say, this says. The fear that it's caused in the firearms community is that because there is no restriction on magazines, you do not need a license to buy a magazine. Virtually every single manufacturer of the firearms that we talked about in semi-automatic with detachable magazines also makes magazines for the same make, the same model. They might be sold in different countries, but they make detachable magazines that are designed to go into that gun. That's what they're designed to do. So they meet your criteria of designed to accept a detachable magazine. So why would we put such ambiguous language in the legislation as to create this problem? Because I simply don't trust. I don't trust the wording in this clause at all. Neither does any other hunter in this country that has a semi-automatic firearm.
So my response to this would be that this is a motion that's put before the committee. The committee and Parliament has the ability to modify the wording of the proposed definition. This can be something that would be passed by Parliament, debated by Parliament, and should a amendment to the definition be agreed upon by Parliament, then that is a decision that could be made at the political level.
Thank you, Madam Clarke. Getting back to hunting, has the department had any consultations with any provincial or territorial ministry responsible for hunting? Because, I'll frame the context here for you. I'm an Albertan, so I'll tell you about what the laws are in Alberta, but I know what they are in Saskatchewan and Ontario and other places. For example, the hunting management unit that's just east of Ottawa right now has a 2-week shotgun hunting period for deer. The provincial regulations clearly say that you can use a semi-automatic shotgun to do so. It doesn't indicate any way, shape, or form whether or not that firearm can have a pistol grip or appear in any way, shape, or form to be a scary type of firearm. So it can be a shotgun that looks like a Defender, the one that I was referencing in my introductory remarks. So has the department consulted with any of the provincial ministries responsible for hunting about how many hunters in their province or territory use those types of firearms, which are now going to be prohibited should this law come to pass?
Thank you for your question. The proposed amendments under G4 do not contain any criteria related to pistol grips, the color of the firearm. I can repeat the criteria, but it has nothing to do with those criteria that you have outlined in your question.
And I could add that even though there's provincial and territorial legislation that refer to different types of firearms, whether they're non-restricted, restricted, or prohibited, once these firearms become prohibited, they will no longer be able to be used or possessed by Canadians for any purpose.
On this list, and I know I'm jumping ahead to 46, but I would imagine that the items on 46 are there because of G4. There are a number of Benelli shotguns that are now going to be prohibited. And Benelli seems to be the only firearm that has a reverse list of exceptions in the schedule. Am I correct in that?
When the Benelli was prescribed as prohibited in the 1990s, there were firearms that were exempted from that definition, and that was a decision made at a political level to exempt these makes and models from the prohibition.
So when Benelli comes out with a new model or new variant of shotgun, we would need an act of Parliament in order to make it legal in Canada, because the Benellis that are legal are provided in a list of exemptions. Virtually every other Benelli that's not on that list is prohibited, correct?
Yes, that would be correct. If the list of exemptions in paragraph 7 of Schedule 1, which is the one that deals with the Benelli M1 and M3 shotguns, which I believe is the one you're referring to, that list is a closed list. So the firearm make and model must be explicitly named in the list in order for it to be exempted, and any new model that comes out would fall within the variant or modified version clause of para 7 and would be prohibited.
Even if it was, by all manner, if it appeared to be a bird hunting semi-automatic shotgun, it would be prohibited automatically because it's simply not on the list.
That's correct, and it's been that way since 1992.
The difference is it would require just a simple order in council in order to put it on the list before. Now it's going to require an act of Parliament in order to do that. Am I missing something, Mr. Smith?
No, that's consistent with my understanding as well.
Yes, that's correct. They will codify these into legislation.
So now, if you're a hunter that uses Benelli firearms, and you want the newest make and model of what Benelli has to offer to the marketplace, you would have to contact your local member of parliament and ask for an amendment to the statutes of Canada in order to be able to purchase and acquire a modern or a new version of a Benelli turkey hunting gun.
Yes, as with any other prohibited firearm.
No, that's not true. Because items used to be able to be put on the schedule through an order in council. Now it requires an act of parliament.
So let me rephrase. Yes, you would have to ask because it would be in statute and codified in the criminal code as a prohibited firearm rather than a delegated authority through the GIC through regulations, which they are now and which some of them have been since the 1990s.
So now that this is moved to codified in the statute, rather than just being something that can be done through an order in council, what are the chances, should this law come to pass, and codify in legislation all of these Benellis, what are the chances of any new Benelli shotguns actually getting into the marketplace in Canada?
So I don't think that we can speculate on that, on what manufacturers would or would not do and how they would enter the market. If my colleague has anything to add to that.
Do you think Benelli would have a legal case of being treated disproportionately?
I think we'd have to ask Benelli's counsel, but they would be prohibited from being imported into Canada.
I'll just add, though, it's not Benelli the manufacturer, right?
I understand.
So it's not
They're
Benelli the manufacturer. Yeah. It's variants of items
understand.
that are prohibited.
I understand.
Thank you.
Getting back to personal defense, I articulated in my opening remarks numerous scenarios where people who are in the outdoors who would currently not have to seek any permission to use their non-restricted shotguns or rifles, like a Tavor chambered in .308, is there anything in this legislation? Because, let's face it, if you have an employee that's working in a dangerous situation, you as an employer have a responsibility to provide your employees with all of the safety equipment that's necessary for them to conduct their duties safely. We've seen this in the RCMP, as a matter of fact. The RCMP had lost a case for not providing the right equipment to their members. Is there any provision in the legislation or the proposed amendments that would allow people who work in dangerous industries where they're proximal to wildlife, where they're they've been charged with the protection of other people, is there any exemptions for them for any of the firearms that they currently use right now? Is there a permitting path? Is there a way for them to get an exemption so that they can continue to use the firearms for which they purchased for the purpose of personal protection? Or will they simply, their firearms that are now slated to go to the prohibited list, go to the prohibited list, too bad, so sad, go buy a different gun? What's the approach?
So what I can say, being from up north and having experienced this because I worked at a fly and fish and hunting camp, no, there's no specific right, there's no right in Canada, the law is well settled, to a specific firearm. Once prohibited, there is no ability to use that for self-defense or any other purpose in the wild. What I can say is there are sometimes authorizations to carry that are provided through the Firearms Act or under the authority of the Firearms Act, and I could possibly turn to my colleague Rochelle and perhaps she can.
Thanks. So under the Firearms Act, there is a mechanism where individuals are allowed to carry or authorized to carry, where they're specifically authorized to carry restricted firearms and use them for either personal protection or for the course of their employment, is what exists right now. So for example, a security guard, a private security guard would have an exemption for the reason of their employment. We also see sometimes for people that are, you mentioned in the north, in terms of for protecting from wildlife, they sometimes will carry more than one, maybe a handgun and a long gun, and restricted firearms can be used in those cases.
So basically what you're saying right now is certain firearms that people are using currently without having to ask for extra permission will be moved to a prohibited list, and the only way that they'll be able to continue to use them for personal protection, and I'm not talking about, of course, I'm not talking about somebody who would be an armored car driver or something like this. This is not the exception I'm talking about. I'm talking about the person who on a northern cruise ship gets off the ship and is charged with the responsibility, should a polar bear come and attack the crew or the guests, currently uses a .24 chambered in .308 or uses a shotgun that is now going to be prohibited, they would have to ask for permission from the local chief firearms officer. And a northern cruise ship would potentially stop in Atlantic Canada, maybe several provinces, each with its own chief firearms officer, might stop in northern Quebec, might stop in Nunavut, might stop in the Northwest Territories. Are you saying that that individual would need an ATC from each of those jurisdictions in order to do their job?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of the firearms, if the firearms they are currently using become prohibited, they won't be able to use them even with an ATC. An ATC applies for restricted firearms.
Only restricted.
However, so that would be the impact if the firearms that they are currently using are prohibited. That
If
would
it's
be the
prohibited,
impact.
it's now rendered useless for all of this, regardless. They would still have to switch to either another non-restricted firearm or get a restricted firearm and then ask for an authorization to carry.
That is correct.
And they would need an authorization to carry from each jurisdiction, correct?
That's correct.
Correct, and that meets the objective of the government in banning all assault-style firearms that they had said in May 2020 and continue to say. So definitely, yes, any prohibited firearm would not be able to be used or possessed.
Okay. It's clear to me, Mr. Chair, that this law has a lot of problems for the practicability of people who live and work in rural and remote communities, and is going to make life less safe for hunters, for Indigenous people living in remote and rural areas, and for people who are employed not necessarily by an organization such as Brinks, but people who are self-employed, lodges and outfitters, and so on. So let's go to lodges and outfitters. As I said in my opening statement, lodges and outfitters, particularly hunting lodges, have basically been decimated by 2 years of COVID and closures and border restrictions. It's not your fault. I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming any of you for anything. Just asking for clarification. We know from talking to the folks in this industry, and whether it's a Canadian going to another country or others coming to Canada for the purpose of hunting, most will bring their own firearms with them or want to. 95% is the number. 95% of Canadians, of hunters prefer to take their own firearms with them. So that would be a Canadian going to the United States or Spain or wherever they happen to be hunting. And it's no different for people who are coming here from other countries. If a firearm that was is now moved to the prohibited list, will that mean that any hunter from outside of Canada can no longer bring any of these prohibited firearms into the country for the purpose of short-term hunting at a guided or outfitted lodge or hunting excursion?
the classification of a firearm as prohibited applies to everybody within Canada, whether they are coming in from the U.S. to hunt as a form of tourism. It applies to any group that uses these firearms as part of a business. It applies to everybody in Canada. There are no exceptions.
So a hunter coming to Canada from another country, I guess it's their duty to know what the laws are if the laws change. How would that be handled by our border agents when somebody is en route to their destination for hunting?
So when an individual enters Canada, they are asked if they have any firearms, to declare any firearms. Again, I'm speaking a little bit outside of my lane. This would be my colleagues at the CBSA, at the Canadian Border Services Agency. But they are asked to declare any firearms that they have. And if they declare that they have any firearms, if they are prohibited, well, then the process that CBSA applies for prohibited firearms would apply.
So I can assume then, Mr. Chair, that numerous people who have come to hunt in Canada before, who brought with them in the past firearms that are hunting in nature or can be used for hunting, will be denied entry into Canada. And I am very concerned, Mr. Chair, about what that will do to our lodges and outfitters in this country, particularly those who offer northern hunting excursions for large moose, for example, in the Yukon, bison, and other large terrestrial mammals. So
Could we just clarify one point? It would be the firearm that would be prohibited from coming into
No, I
Canada
understand.
and not the individuals?
I understand, but 95% of people want to use their own guns, and if they're not allowed to bring their gun, they're not coming, ma'am. That's just the way it is. That will have definitely an adverse impact on our lodges and outfitters. So I guess my question to the officials that are here, does the department have any information about what the impact will be to our guides and outfitters across this country should all of the firearms that are currently on the list and scheduled to be prohibited, should this law come to pass? What will be the net economic consequence to our lodges and outfitters?
No, we do not have that information before us.
Mr. Calkin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, I could keep going, but I'm pretty sure I see what the writing on the wall is here, that this is a political exercise, not an economic exercise, not a hunting exercise, not a public safety exercise. So I will give up my time until I think of some other questions that I'm sure I know what the answer is going to be.
So thank you, Mr. Calkin, for your interventions today. So we are at the end of our time. I propose that we adjourn and resume in the next meeting from the point we left off. Adjourn. Suspending messes up all kinds of things. So we adjourn and we will resume the next meeting from the point where we left off, which would mean that the next speaker would be Madame Michaud, followed by Mr. Nur Mohammed, followed by Mr. Ruff.
Just a quick point of order, sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I know that you had suspended when Mr. Tlaib had been, or Mr. Nur Mohammed, pardon me, had been doing his comments. Can you explain why that is different than today? Why were we able to suspend then and not today on Mr. Calkin's remarks?
Well, I could suspend, but it messes up scheduling, it messes up giving notices and all kinds of stuff. So I've been advised by my very capable clerk that it's better for the organization, for the administration, if we adjourn as we did last time, and adjourn with the understanding that we will commence where we left off on the next meeting.
So there'll be no more suspensions then?
Well, there may be, but we're going to try and avoid it because it does mess up the administration. So the effect for us is the same. The effect for them is better. Okay.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. So just for everyone's benefit, as we adjourn, we're going to pick up. The understanding is we'll have the speakers list exactly where it is as it stands right now.
Exactly right.
So it would be
the motion will remain moved The speakers list will carry on from where we are now. Mr. Calkin is finished. Next on the list is Madame Michaud. And if that's the understanding, everybody's good with that. Mr. Ruff.
Yeah, I just want some clarity because I know I do have more questions that are very specific, and I know unfortunately I didn't get a chance to address to Mr. Smith or I'm assuming Mr. Daly's with him as well. That would be beneficial to have them there as the experts, and I know they're busy people as well, and I'm not trying to cause them, but I'm just wanting to make sure they're going to be invited back.
We will continue to invite all of these wonderful witnesses, and we certainly do appreciate all of the input, and recognize it's difficult sometimes to answer your questions. But that being the case, we are now, and you're on the list, sir, after Mr. Nur Mohammed. So we are now adjourned.